Hello and welcome to Just Streaming Academy. My name is Yuzu and I am the Academy lead at Just Streaming. Today is the first of a three-part series for learning to make a mashup without any production experience whatsoever. And for the first class, we'll be going over how to get started in Ableton for the first time. Alright, so I got a fresh copy of Ableton open up right now. And Ableton actually has two views. We are currently in the session view. Go ahead and press tab and you'll see that this here is the arrangement view. You can also switch between these views at the top right over here by clicking this. You can switch between session and arrangement view. Now, Ableton Live is a DAW designed for musicians to play their music live. However, as Ableton has improved as a DAW, we've started using it in more regular production workflows. All right, before we get into any production, let's first take a look at our settings. Now, to get to the settings, you want to go to the top, find Live, and hit Settings. Let's go ahead and click on the Audio tab, and you'll see here the audio output device is currently set to Minifuse. This is my interface. Now, in Ableton, one of the pain points is whenever you switch your default output device, this thing often disappears and it might look something like so. And you'll get this warning that the audio engine is off at the bottom left over there. And so if you ever see that issue, make sure to go into settings, click on audio, and just select the correct default and just select the correct output device that you want. And so for me, that's going to be my Minifuse. And you'll see now audio will be working just fine. The other thing to note is in the record, warp, and launch settings. Let's take a look in the warp and fade section. The most important one here is create fades on clip edges. We want to make sure that that is turned off. The rest of these settings will be helpful for the rest of this course, so I do recommend copying all of these settings. And as the relevance of these settings pop up, I will talk about them more in detail. All right, let's get started. Now, I understand that Ableton can be daunting and overwhelming when you open it for the first time. In fact, many pro producers don't know the full extent of the features that Ableton provides. So for this course, I'll be teaching you exactly what you need to know when you get started with producing and making mashups. The first thing to take a look at is the top left over here. If you click on this number over here, this is your BPM, and we can set our BPM to whatever we'd like. Let's say I want to produce house, so I'm going to set this to 126. I'm typing in 126 on my keyboard and hitting enter. And now our BPM is set to 126. The second thing to keep an eye on is this here. This is our key of the track. Now, when you're doing mashups, this is not so important, but it's still good and very handy to know that this feature is available. Let's say I want to make my song in F minor. And you'll see that there's a lot of options in terms of scales here. The main ones that you want to take a look at are major and minor. You can use the Camelot wheel to find the key of your track and select it here. Now let's take our attention to the bottom left over here. If we hover our mouse over this, it will say Info View. The Info View provides a brief description of the user interface elements that the mouse is currently over. And so this is a great way of understanding bits of Ableton that you don't already know. So let's say we mouse over these two dots over here. We can take a look at the bottom left and it says metronome. Click here to activate the metronome. And so as expected, you can click to activate the metronome and click again, deactivate the metronome. Next, let's bring our attention to the right side here where we have 4 different tracks. These are essentially lanes where you can add samples and your instruments to start producing. You'll notice that there are 2 types of tracks here. There are 2 audio tracks and 2 MIDI tracks. As we get started, we're mostly going to be using audio tracks, as this is where we're going to be adding all of our samples. MIDI is essentially sheet music, where you can instruct an instrument to play whatever you like, or you can play the instrument itself using a MIDI keyboard. I'm going to select a 2. Now, Ableton is quite intuitive, and what I just did was I shift-click the 2. So if you click on one of the tracks and hold shift and click on the other, you will select both of these MIDI tracks, just like on any other computer software. All right, we can right click and click delete. But before you do, you'll notice that there are a list of options that you can do to this track. And on the right, you can see exactly what the shortcuts are. And so for delete, we can also hit the delete key to delete these tracks. Okay, and now we're left with just these 2 audio tracks. All right, we're almost at the part where we actually add sounds into Ableton, but first thing is that Ableton does provide its own list of samples. However, I recommend every producer to build their own library of samples and presets that fits their genre and matches their sound. The best way to go about this is using a software called Splice. Now, Splice is a sample and preset library where you can purchase sounds with credits. You'll notice that I've hoarded a lot of credits over here, but buying credits is a subscription program. Once you've purchased per month, you will get some amount of credits based on the plan that you've selected. And even if you haven't spent all the credits that month, they will carry over to future months. Now, if you only plan to make mashups, Splice is not necessarily required for you. However, having a certain set of credits can be beneficial for you to add effects to your mashup if you need it. Let's start by searching for a top loop. I'm going to be searching for a house top loop. We can take this one. And so to grab this, I'm going to purchase it with one of my credits here. And then I can click and drag over to Ableton and drop it, the file here. All right, so let's take a listen to what it sounds like inside of the DAW. Play your track, you can press the play button up in the middle here. You can stop with the stop button. However, this is quite tedious, and the faster way of doing this is pressing space. You can press space again to stop the music. You'll notice that Ableton will play from wherever you have selected, and so if I select earlier on, it will start playing from here. And if we select in the middle of the track, it will also play from here. What you can also do is loop the track. So let's select the region that we want to loop, and what we're going to do is hit Command L if you're on Mac, Control L if you're on Windows. And so let's take a listen again. Now you'll notice that there's a little bit of a break here, and that doesn't quite feel right. And you might have also noticed that there is a grid system inside of Ableton. We'll talk about that in just a second. First thing is this pattern here is at 128 BPM, and it actually says in the sample itself, as it is very well named. Most samples on Splice are named quite well, as they have a BPM if it's a loop and a key if there's tonality to the sound. What we need to do now is align this to the beat grid. Firstly, there's a difference between clicking on the bottom of the clip versus the top of the clip. You'll notice that at the bottom, we're essentially selecting the waveform itself, and at the top, we will select the entire clip. And quick note, these are called clips, while this row is called a track. What we're going to do is double click on this clip, and we're going to go into the clip editor. What we're going to do is hit the warp button here, and then we're going to set this to Complex Pro. And then here, we're going to set our BPM to 128. Now, you might be wondering, wait, our track is at 126. Why are we setting this BPM to 128? Well, this is actually not the BPM of our track. This is the BPM of this track over here. Think of this like you're currently playing a track that's at 126 BPM, and you're trying to bring in a new track that's at 128. Rekordbox needs to know that your new track is at 128 BPM so that when you hit beat sync, it will automatically warp it to 126. And so in this case, we need to tell Ableton as well that this track is at 128 BPM so that it can warp it correctly. Now there's a few ways to exit this view. You can either double click on the track here, or you can simply drag this down. However, I prefer to click Shift Tab, as it's the fastest way to get back to this view. Now this region is one that would be affected by the settings that we were touching. If your settings are different from mine, that's totally fine. Now these warping features are one of the settings that we were playing around with earlier. If we take a look at the settings, you notice that we have loop warp short samples and auto warp long samples. I prefer to keep these off, especially if I'm dragging in tracks for referencing. All right, so you notice that even after all the changes, we still have this little bit at the end of the grid that we still need to fix. All we need to do is drag the sample out, and now you'll see that it fits perfectly within the beat grid. And let's take a listen. Awesome. Now let's take a look at the beat grid. This beat grid is very similar to the beat grid that's available in Rekordbox, except for the fact that we can change the size of the grids. So if we right click anywhere on an empty track, we can move our mouse down to the fixed grid region, and we're going to click quarter notes. On Rekordbox or Serato, your beat grid is essentially locked into this quarter note setting. Now what we're going to do is add a kick drum to the sample. So let's look for a kick loop. A cool thing to note is that Ableton has recently integrated Splice into the UI itself, and you can easily search for samples here. Now I'm going to set the key to be in F minor. Now you can apply the key from your DAW, which is F minor. However, since we're looking for a kick, this doesn't really matter. And then we're going to look at our BPM, and our BPM is already in the range of our track. Now let's look for some kick drums. I like this one. So let's drag this in. This is how you would drag any audio file into Ableton. Right, now we have this kick drum over here. Let's play this. And of course, we want more kick drums. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in and copy this a little more. So to zoom in, you want to hold Command and scroll your wheel in. You can also increase the height of any track by using Option and scroll wheel open and scroll wheel close. However, I prefer to just drag this as it's a little bit more accurate than using the scroll wheel. All right, now that we've zoomed in, what we're going to do is we're going to copy this onto every quarter note. So I'm going to click this, hit Control C for copy, or you can select copy here. And then here I'm going to hit paste. Paste a few times, and now we have the kick drum playing 4 times. Now there's a faster way of copying everything, which is using the duplicate feature. So let's select the region that we want to duplicate, and we can right click and hit duplicate. You'll notice that duplicate copied this white space over here because I had it selected. If we were to select from this region down and hit duplicate, you'll notice that it no longer lines up with the beat grid correctly. So what we're going to do is hit this, and I'm going to hit Command D for duplicate, and then select this new region and hit Command D again, and now we have kick drums filled out for our entire track. And now this top loop makes way more sense. All right, let's talk about phrasing for a second, because you'll notice that Ableton has these dark regions and these light regions in the grid. This is very useful as it follows multiples of 2, and phrasing also always follows multiples of 2. And so as we scroll out, you'll notice that this entire region also gets selected, and this is exactly 4 bars. And if we change our fixed beat grid to 4 bars, you'll notice that this is exactly 4 bars. And so here we have our 8-bar phrase or a 16-bar phrase. I'm going to right click back and go back to quarter notes. For the last sample that we're going to add, I'm going to go back to the regular Splice app to look for a bass pattern. We're going to search for a house bass loop. Nice, I like this one, so I'm going to add this in my credits. I'm going to click and drag out to my Ableton here and add it in. And you'll notice that as we add a new audio file, it will automatically add a new audio track. If you want to add an audio track manually, you can right click here and you'll see insert audio track. And you'll notice that Command T or Control T if you're on Windows is the hotkey to add new audio tracks. So if I hit Command T a bunch of times, now I get a bunch of audio tracks. We don't need these, so I'm going to get rid of this. Now let's align this to the beat grid again. So we're going to double click and hit Warp, Complex Pro, and then this track is at 124 BPM. We're going to hit 124. Now you'll notice that this track is in E minor, whereas our track is in F minor. Now this doesn't really matter since we haven't really selected a key yet. I just picked one arbitrarily. So in this case, we can just use this loop and set our key to E minor. Now, again, after we've warped this track, it doesn't quite align to the beat grid. And in this case, we've actually shortened the track, so there's a little bit of extra information at the end right here. To get rid of this, you just need to drag this in, let go, and then drag it back out, and now it lines up perfectly. I swear Ableton used to adjust the track length for you, but I guess this is new. All right, let's take a listen. Alright, so this is clearly too loud. There's a few things that we should be doing to this. Now, if you're an experienced producer, you might be thinking this needs sidechain really bad, or we should be adding headroom to our tracks. So let's go with the second option, where we decrease the volume of our track so that it's not so loud. If you look on the right, we can adjust the volume of our track using this blue box with a number 0. If we click and hold, we can drag up or down to increase or decrease the volume of the track. And in Ableton, if there's any value, you can always double click to reset its value. Additionally, you can also hit the solo button to listen to just the track alone. The solo button is the equivalent to the Q button on most DJ controllers. However, solo is the more common term used within Pro Audio. If you prefer to use hotkeys, you can use Shift S to solo your track. And now let's take a listen and decrease the volume. I want this to hit -6, so I'm going to type in -6 here. And you see you can change the value just like we changed the BPM up on the top left. I'm going to unsolo the track and I'm going to apply -6 to the rest of the tracks. And now if we take a listen, it won't be as loud. One more feature that we need to take a look at is how to turn on and off these tracks. So if we click on this orange button here, the track will be deactivated, and if we take a listen, the bass will no longer be there. And if we click this again, the universal hotkey in Ableton to toggle tracks is 0. So if we hit 0 on our keyboard, it will toggle the track on and off. You can also toggle clips themselves on and off by hitting 0, and you'll notice that it gets grayed out, and we again cannot hear the bass line. Alright, so now we've created a very basic track. Let's, for the sake of this, duplicate this over, and then I'm going to duplicate this as well. And now we have a full 8-bar loop. And so if we click 4 bars, you'll see that there are 4 bars here. Now the reason why I didn't click 8 bars is if you click 8, Ableton actually locks into these groupings of 8, and you'll see that we're kind of sitting in the middle here. It does start at the very beginning, so we could fix this by selecting everything and moving to the beginning. And so now we have an 8-bar loop. When I produce, I prefer to have this little white space for myself, and so I'm always going to be lined up to the 4 bars, but not to 8 bars. All right, now that we've made a quick house beat, let's start renaming some of these tracks. So I'm going to right-click on this track here, hit rename, and we're going to call this kick. You'll notice that to rename, the hotkey is Command R. So I'm just going to hit Command R, say pop. Here, we'll call this bass loop. Now let's go ahead and save this project. Go to File, Save Live Set As. I've created my own production folder, so I have all my projects organized here. And I'm just going to call this a simple house starter. Okay. Now we're going to open up a new project. And here I've already cleaned it up, so we only have a single audio file. Now I'm going to grab a track from Rekordbox, and we're going to beat align the track. Let's go to Rekordbox and look for some track. And what I'm going to do is right-click on it, show in Finder. Here's the track right here, and then I'm going to Alt-Tab to Ableton and simply drag it in. And now we have the track inside of Ableton itself. If we go back to Rekordbox, the BPM of our track is 126. So let's set the BPM in Ableton to 126. And now let's align the beat grid. So let's assume that our starting point is right here. What I'm actually going to do is go up to the top here and right click and say add locator. And we're just going to call this start. This is just to make it easier to see exactly where your starting point is. I'm sure y'all have all zoomed in into Rekordbox and looked at the waveforms a little bit. And when you're trying to align your beat grid inside a Rekordbox, you're normally looking for the kick drums. And so likewise in Ableton, we're going to be doing the same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the top and I'm going to drag it around. And you'll notice that it's being locked into the grid itself. What we're going to do is hit Command, and this is going to allow us to freely drag the track however we please. Let's just drag the track here, and then I'm going to zoom in, And you'll notice that this is from over here. So this is something like that. And so now I'm going to double check. I might be completely off. So I'm going to look around for where another kick drum might be. And so this looks like the chorus over here. So let's zoom in. Now this is a good time to point at the main volume down here. Main is the final output of your track. And if you click on the 0, you can set this to -10. I'm going to set my main output to -10. Now, quick thing to note is if you set this to -6, you'll cut the track in exactly half the volume. And if you set to -12, now we've cut the track in a quarter of its volume. For our sake, I just like typing in 10. So I'm going to have it at -10. And let's take a look. All right, so now let's line up the beat grid. I'm just going to take a listen to the track first and look for a point that we can search for.
Hold up.
So there's a kick drum right there. And it's a little bit harder to see than in record because you don't have any colors. And so what we're going to do is going to drag the audio file in line. Now you'll notice that it's currently not moving because it's aligning up to the beat grid. And so if we hit Command, you'll notice that now we can move this track freely. And I'll drag it somewhere just around here. And I'm going to hit Command to zoom in again. And now it's really hard to tell exactly where the kick drum really starts here. So I'm just going to leave this here arbitrarily. I'm going to look for another point where I might be able to reference the kick drum. Maybe we can try one of these snares. And this is a lot more obvious here. And so I'm going to click and drag this. Snare starts about here. It doesn't have to be super aligned. I just like to get it super tight. And now this should be lined up quite nicely. So of course there's going to be this little bit at the end. I like to get rid of this. And the reason is now the track is permanently in line. And I say this because if I were to drag this down, my beat grid is still aligned properly. This is because Ableton always locks the track to the front of the grid. So we go back to our region over here. Zoom in. There's a snare over there. Super blurry. Right here, it's still aligned. Let's fix this up. So let's figure out where the downbeat is. I do want the start to be the first downbeat of the track. And so what I'm going to do is look for where the downbeat is. It looks like it's about here. If I drag this over another bar, is the
I'm a little salty, but they kinda like it when I get a little ballsy. Gotta level up, gotta get naughty. Better let to leave when I was
Yep, there's a new phrase.
naughty.
There's that impact. And this would be the build-up right here. And so you notice that because we've now lined up the beat grid correctly, these regions of dark and light make it very obvious to see where the phrasing is, even without selecting the correct size for a beat grid. I currently have quarter notes. However, if I have it 4 bars, then it's even easier to see where the phrases are. All right. Let's say we already had a mashup idea. And so I'm just going to go into Rekordbox and look for another track that is in key with Get Naughty. And let's just say set it off. What I'm going to do is right click, go in Finder, and also drag this into Ableton. All right, so we have a little bit of a situation here where Get Naughty is at 126 BPM and Set It Off is at 135. So let's just find like a middle ground of 130 BPM for the sake of demonstration. And before we do that, I'm actually going to double click on this. Well, you notice that I haven't set this to be warped yet. So I'm going to do that right now and warp it. It's going to already be at 126 BPM, which is fine. So I'm going to leave it like that. Now I'm going to come up here and type 130 and Get Naughty will still be beat aligned. I'm going to turn this one off so I don't have to listen to it, and we're just going to listen to Get Naughty and just make sure it is properly aligned. Or listen from.
Hold up.
Yep, that's right on the grid. So now let's take a look at set it off, and you'll notice I've just toggled so that we're only listening to set it off. I'm going to double click and let's set the warp mode. And if we go back, we can see that this track is at 135 BPM. So let's tell Ableton this is at 135. Now this should be warped correctly. If we take a listen, now we just need to find the downbeat. Try to guess it first. So from the vocal, I'm gonna say here. Okay. Oh, there we go. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut off this a little bit just so it's easy to drag, because this is seemingly where that downbeat is. And then I'm just going to drag this in line. This makes it very nice, easy. And then now that we have that, I'm just going to drag this back out. Nice. So that looks like it's aligned. Can't really tell from that grid. Let's look for a kick drum again. That snare crash, nice, but we still. Here, is it obvious? It's still not obvious. That might be grid 2. Again, this does look correct though. If you like look from afar, I just want to find a very obvious point to make it properly. Now you can also, there's a few other ways of doing this. You can obviously turn on the metronome or just play another track at the same time, and it would be a great way of checking. I think this track is just not going to give me good opportunity. Let's see. We can actually move right a little bit if there's, yeah, right a little bit. The kick drum. So some tracks it will just be a little bit more difficult. Totally fine. And you don't have to be this anal about it as well, as long as it's like pretty close here. And you know what? I'm just gonna say that this is totally fine, and we're now beat aligned. So if we play both tracks at the same time, this will not sound nice. However, it should theoretically be beat aligned. I'm just gonna set both tracks to -6, and then take a listen. And now they're already like mashing themselves up without me having to do anything, just because they are beat aligned and phrase aligned. All right, and that will be the first class. You've now opened Ableton for the first time. You've made a quick beat using Splice, and you now know how to beat align your tracks in Ableton. In the next class, we'll be taking your DJ skills and showing you how to do them in Ableton. I'll see you next class.